that don't involve the more attention-grabbing direct physical confrontation, but nevertheless raise the social cost of fascism and hopefully deter people from doing fascist things. I'm providing them here strictly as examples, not necessarily as prescriptions, though, side note, if you are going to tear down fascist posters, do use your keys, because sometimes they like to hide razor blades behind them. Liberals tend not to take serious anti-fascist action because fascism is super effective against liberalism for reasons that I've explained before here. So amongst anti-fascist actors, you will tend, not always, but tend to find people who are a little bit further left than liberal, and maybe who even have criticisms of liberalism as a political philosophy. That might include communists and anarchists, as the symbol with the red and black flag indicates, or it might include people who haven't really picked a political label and who are just there in response to some specific issue in their local community, and that bit's quite important. Since there is no overarching Antifa structure, anti-fascists tend to organise locally and flexibly in response to specific local issues. So for instance, maybe the EDL are organising a far-right rally in a particular borough of London, and anti-fascist actors from that borough might get together to try and organise a counter-demonstration in response to that specific local issue. Anti-fascism has a long and proud history. Ever since fascism first crystallised in the early 20th century, there have been people organising across the left to fight it. In Italy and Germany to begin, with groups like Arditi del Popolo and Antifascistische Action. In those days, some anti-fascists did form groups with official structures, and then later, when fascist groups like the British Union of Fascists and the American Friends of New Germany cropped up, citizens started taking action in response. Something very worth bearing in mind is that not only are there a lot of honest misconceptions about Antifa out there are some downright lies going around as well. So for instance, after the Las Vegas mass shooting of October 2017, various right-wing pundits lied that Mr. Paddock, the murderer, had Antifa literature in his room, whatever that means. Following the Texas mass shooting of November 2017, people again lied that Mr. Kelly, the murderer, was a member of Antifa. Just be on your guard for stuff that might include tenuous speculations or fake screenshots that is designed to give you a false impression. We'll talk more about propaganda later on. Usually it's easy to spot this stuff. Anything that talks about somebody being a member of Antifa, that's a bit of a red flag because you can't be a member of it. But in the interests of getting an accurate impression, not necessarily a politically inclined impression, but just an accurate one, do be conscientious. Since the goal of anti-fascist action is to stop people from building fascism, one criticism of it, or at least one constantly relevant question, is, does it work? Because anti-fascist action tends to be local and specific, that's a question that rightly comes up whenever anti-fascists decide what tactics to use and what issues to respond to. It can't really be answered in the general form, does it work? Kind of like, does protest work? Can't really be answered in the abstract because it depends on what happens and how it's used, and also what we consider to be a workable outcome. Kind of like the question, does music make movies more effective? It's like, well, sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't, but it depends on what kind of music and the context and how it's used, and also what you consider the word effective to mean there. One question that anti-fascists are asking themselves a lot more nowadays is how to effectively combat the new form of fascism today, which is trying to find mainstream appeal by toning down the Hitler salutes and the overt racism, and using online spaces as well as the streets to grow their movement. The old school tactics of street confrontation might be effective, but not quite sufficient in the face of this new form of fascism. And we'll talk more about that later on. Because anti-fascist action is local and specific, another criticism of it comes from, among others, journalist Li Fang, who says that there are potentially bigger threats to progressive politics than your local skinhead Nazi. Big companies like G4S, Serco, BAE Systems, they have a lot more power than your local Nazi, and they profit from the kind of authoritarian, militarist, racist violence that fascism feeds on. So mightn't it be better to direct energies protesting and working against them? Mightn't it be better to just ignore the relatively small local neo-Nazi chapter? And certainly that's a line that you could take, although anti-fascists might respond by saying that we can in fact fight both small-scale fascism and larger-scale fascistic politics. And also, the influence of small-scale fascist organising on the media and through the media on politics shouldn't be ignored. For instance, see Charlottesville, which, although relatively small scale, echoed right round the world. Hitler started out with 45 guys. Mussolini started out with just 100. So the anti-fascist stance is that it's probably better to nip these things in the bud, because in the right soil they can grow like that. Speaking of which, in order to fully understand anti-fascists, we also need to understand Part 2. Fascism. A common question that comes up when we're talking about taking direct action against fascism is, how do we decide who's a fascist? And there are two ways of asking this question. One is very, very helpful and clever, and the other one isn't so much. The not very helpful way of asking this question is, how do we decide who's a fascist? With the implied answer being that we can't, and therefore anti-fascist action is moot and off the table. The reason that isn't very helpful is that it stops anybody really learning anything. It's kind of the end of the conversation, and it also allows fascists to carry on. People who ask this version of the question usually want some abstracted, foolproof answer or some formula for definitely identifying a fascist, which obviously stacks the deck against a theory that is local and specific and flexible in its application. The clever way of asking the question is, how do we decide who's a fascist? And use that as a jumping off point to learn more about fascism and how to spot it. And that's the way we're going to ask the question. The word fascist is often used to just mean authoritarian or aggressive, but that's not the most helpful way of using it, because it allows people to draw a false equivalence between the authoritarianism of, say, Lenin with the authoritarianism of Hitler. Although both were authoritarian, they went about it in very different ways for very different reasons, and only one can accurately be called a fascist. Since fascism has been around for about 100 years now, it's had a few different versions. It's an essentially conservative ideology, all about preserving some mythologized version of the way things used to be, or restoring past glory to make a glorious future. In general, fascism is characterized by being less fond of democracy and more fond of dictatorship, very pro-military and pro-police, pro the state, particularly in ways that encourage narrow views of nationalism and patriotism, often in xenophobic ways or ways that tie nationalism to race. Pro-toxic masculinity, according to which straight cis men should be dominant over and violent towards people of other genders. Pro-capitalism, and hand in hand with that, very anti-communist, and particularly relevantly for today's fascism, virulently racist against people of colour, and very anti-Semitic. Those last two go hand in hand, as we'll be seeing later. The historian Robert Paxton gives a good overview. He says fascism is a form of political behaviour marked by obsessive preoccupation with community decline, humiliation, or victimhood, and by compensatory cults of unity, energy, and purity in which a mass-based party of committed nationalist militants, working in uneasy but effective collaboration with traditional elites, abandons democratic liberties and pursues with redemptive violence and without ethical or legal restraints goals of internal cleansing and external expansion. The collaboration with traditional elites bit is important there. In my country there's a popular image of fascists as uneducated or working class skinheads, but that's increasingly outdated. As we'll be seeing later, many of today's fascists are educated, wealthy and polished. Some of these features might be emphasised more than others. For instance, contemporary Euro-American fascism leans hard on the white supremacy angle. There were 20th century Chinese and Japanese versions of fascism that obviously didn't subscribe to that bit. Not everybody who has one or two of these features is necessarily a fascist, and fascists know that if they can find ways in which they can appear to not fit all of them all the time, they might be able to fool you. Like, we can't be fascist, we've got a black person or a gay person in our movement. Kind of like the old, I can't be racist because I have a black friend move, or the I can't be sexist because I have a wife and a daughter move. But in general, these are the hallmarks to look out for. It's important to note that fascism is not a wholly different kind of government from the one you might know, and it did not end in 1945. For instance, most of these features I described would also, in milder forms, describe a certain American presidency. That's right. The Reagan administration. which actually was so okay with fascism that it actually supported fascist governments with money and weapons, for instance in Guatemala. Something else worth bearing in mind is that this form of government based on racist violence and exploitation